Dates are the oldest cultivated fruit on earth, and somehow most people treat them like a footnote in a holiday gift basket. The date palm, Phoenix dactylifera, has been growing alongside human civilization for so long that historians cannot pinpoint exactly when we started farming it. The best evidence suggests deliberate date palm cultivation began somewhere between 6000 and 800 years ago in the region that now spans Iraq, Iran, and the Arabian Peninsula. Ancient Mesopotamian records reference dates as currency, as religious offering, as military ration, as medicine. The Egyptians used date wine in burial rituals. The date palm appears more times in the Quran than any other fruit-bearing plant. Arab traders carried date varieties along every major trade route from Persia to Spain to the Indus Valley. When Spanish missionaries arrived in California in the 18th century, they brought date palms with them, establishing groves in the Coachella Valley that still produce fruit today. The date is not just old food, it is the food that walked alongside civilization from its very beginning, feeding armies and traders and pilgrims and farmers across a span of time that makes every other cultivated fruit look like a recent experiment. And what is remarkable is that after all of that history, after thousands of years of being eaten by billions of people across dozens of cultures, the date is still misunderstood by most of the people who encounter it in the modern world. Most people think of dates as sweet, sticky, and vaguely medicinal. They have never tasted a fresh date pulled off a palm hours before eating, or a semi-dry variety with the complexity of caramel and the texture of firm custard, or a rare cultivar that tastes of honey and cinnamon and something almost floral that no other food produces. That entire spectrum is what this video is about. The Medjool is where almost everyone begins, and there is a reason for that, though the reason is not the one most people assume. Medjool dates are not the most commonly grown variety in the world. They are not the oldest, they are not even the sweetest. What they are is the largest, the most dramatic in presentation, and the most immediately impressive to someone encountering a date for the first time. A ripe Medjool is enormous by date standards, dark amber to deep brown, plump, glistening slightly, with a wrinkled skin that parts easily to reveal a flesh that is dense, moist, and intensely sweet. The flavor is rich and complex, molasses, brown sugar, a faint caramel note, and underneath all of that, a warmth that lingers. The texture is soft without being wet, substantial without being dry, and it coats the mouth in a way that makes it feel more like a confection than a fruit. Medjool dates were historically called the fruit of kings in Morocco, where they were grown almost exclusively for royalty and not available to the general population for much of their early cultivation history. When a blight nearly wiped out Morocco's Medjool palms in the 1920s, the United States Department of Agriculture intervened and brought offshoots to California for safekeeping, which is why the Coachella Valley became a Medjool production center and why California Medjools are now some of the finest available anywhere. If you have eaten only one type of date in your life, it was almost certainly a Medjool, and while that is a fine place to start, it is nowhere near the end of the story. The Deglet Noor is the variety that actually runs the world's date trade, which surprises people who assume the Medjool must dominate by volume simply because it dominates by presence. Deglet Noor, the name translates roughly from Arabic as date of light. A reference to the way light passes through its amber flesh when held up is the most commercially produced date variety globally, grown in enormous quantities across Algeria, Tunisia, the United States, and the wider Middle East. It is semi-dry rather than soft, which means it has a lower moisture content than a Medjool, a firmer and slightly chewier texture, and a flavor that is sweet but more restrained honey-forward, mildly nutty, clean in a way that doesn't overwhelm. The Deglet Noor is the date that appears chopped in baked goods, pressed into date sugar, packaged in bulk for export, and used in industrial food production precisely because its lower moisture content gives it a longer shelf life and makes it easier to process at scale. It is not as immediately seductive as a Medjool, and I think that comparative modesty has worked against its reputation unfairly. Eaten fresh at peak ripeness, a Deglet Noor has a delicacy and a clean sweetness that is genuinely beautiful in a way that the more intense Medjool sometimes isn't the Medjool can feel like it's making a speech, while the Deglet Noor is having a quiet conversation. The Sukkari date is one of the most revered varieties in Saudi Arabia, and outside the Arabian Peninsula it is virtually unknown. which is one of the more unjust gaps in global fruit knowledge. Sukkari means sugary in Arabic, and the name is completely accurate. This is one of the sweetest dates produced anywhere, with a honey-like intensity that arrives immediately and builds rather than fading. But the sweetness alone doesn't explain the devotion it inspires. The Sukkari has a texture that changes dramatically based on how it's handled. Fresh and young, at the rutab stage when it's only partially ripe, it is soft, almost creamy, with a faint crunch near the skin, and a flavor that is lighter and more floral than it becomes with further ripening. Fully ripe and dried, it firms slightly, the sweetness concentrates, and a butterscotch quality emerges that makes eating a single date feel like a deliberate, unhurried experience. In Saudi Arabia, the Sukkari is the date of hospitality, the one placed in front of a guest with coffee, the one given as a gift, the one that carries cultural weight beyond its simple existence as fruit. The fact that most of the world eats medjools while the Sukkari sits largely undiscovered outside its home region is exactly the kind of injustice that food culture creates when logistics and marketing decide what gets seen and what stays hidden. The Ajwa date holds a position in Islamic tradition that no other variety shares, and understanding that position changes how you see the fruit entirely. Grown exclusively in and around Medina in Saudi Arabia, the Ajwa is a small, dark, almost black date with a dry, firm texture and a flavor that is less immediately sweet than a Medjool or Sukkari, deeper, more complex, with notes of dark chocolate, dried fig, and something faintly smoky that you don't expect and then can't stop noticing. The Prophet Muhammad is recorded in Hadith as recommending Ajwa dates specifically, saying that whoever eats 7 Ajwa dates in the morning will be protected from poison and magic that day. Whether you approach that statement spiritually or historically, its effect on the date's cultural significance has been enormous. Ajwa dates are among the most expensive in the world, sought after by Muslim pilgrims visiting Medina, gifted during Ramadan as something between food and blessing, and consumed with an intentionality that most food never receives. The Ajwa palm is notoriously difficult to cultivate outside its original region. Attempts to grow it commercially elsewhere have met with limited success, which has kept supply restricted and the cultural mystique intact. There is something worth sitting with in the idea of a food so tied to a specific place that it cannot truly be replicated anywhere else. The Ajwa is Medina in a way that goes beyond metaphor. The Barhi date is the one that will change your mind about what a date is if you have only ever eaten the dried or semi-dried versions that travel well enough to reach international markets. The Barhi, named after a hot Arabian wind called the bar, is best eaten at the kalal stage, which is the point in the ripening process before the date has begun to soften and darken. At this stage, the Barhi is yellow to light amber, firm, and genuinely crunchy, a texture that nobody expects from a date because nobody tells you dates can be eaten this way. The flavor at kalal is sweet but also faintly tangy, almost like a cross between a date and a very ripe apple, with none of the concentrated sweetness that comes later in the ripening process. As it ripens further into the rutab stage, it softens and the flavor intensifies. By the time it's fully ripe, it tastes like butterscotch wrapped in silk. Most markets that carry Barhi dates sell them in the soft ripe stage because it's what people expect a date to look like. If you find them yellow and crunchy at a Middle Eastern market or a date farm, buy them immediately. You are not looking at an unripe date. You are looking at a different experience entirely, one that challenges everything you thought you knew about this fruit's range. The Khudri date is the everyday workhorse of the Saudi date world, and the phrase everyday workhorse should not be read as a criticism. The Khudri is large, dark reddish brown, moderately sweet, slightly chewy, with a flavor that is consistent and dependable without being plain. It travels well, it stores well, it costs significantly less than premium varieties like the Ajwa or the Sukkari, and it is eaten in enormous quantities across Saudi Arabia and the wider Gulf region, not because it's the best date available, but because it is. Reliably excellent in the way that the best everyday foods always are, the ones that show up without ceremony and deliver something genuinely satisfying every single time. The Khudri is the date people eat during Ramadan, iftar, not as a special occasion, but as a daily ritual, a predictable comfort that holds its quality from the first day of the month to the last. That consistency is its own kind of excellence, and the food world does not celebrate it enough because drama and rarity get more attention than dependability, even when dependability is the harder thing to achieve. The Zahidi date is the unexpected one, and it is the date I would give to someone who insists they don't like dates. Most date aversion comes from the same place: too sweet, too sticky, too heavy, too much of everything at once. The Zahidi sits outside that profile almost entirely. It is medium-sized, oval, with a smooth golden skin and a semi-dry texture that is firmer than a Medjool and lighter in color than most varieties. The flavor is mild and nutty. Some people describe it as reminiscent of peanut butter or butterscotch, but softer and cleaner, without the intensity that makes other dates feel demanding. The sweetness is present but restrained, the kind of sweetness that sits quietly in the background rather than announcing itself at the door. Zahidi dates are widely grown in Iraq, Iran, and California, and they are often used in cooking in chutneys, in bread, in rice dishes, in savory applications where a date that won't overwhelm everything around it is exactly what the recipe needs. The Zahidi is proof that the date world has more range than most people give it credit for, and that somewhere in that range is a variety suited to every kind of palate, including the ones that have decided they already know what a date tastes like. The Halawi date carries a name that means sweet in Arabic, which sounds redundant until you eat one and understand that the people who named it were trying to say something specific about a sweetness that is different in character from every other variety. Halawi dates are soft, amber, medium-sized, and the sweetness they carry is light, almost delicate, closer to caramel than to molasses, with a faint floral quality and a moisture level that keeps them from ever feeling cloying. They are grown primarily in Iraq, where date palm cultivation has a history stretching back to the earliest days of Mesopotamian civilization, and they are considered one of the finest soft varieties produced in the country that arguably has the deepest relationship with this fruit on earth. Iraq was once the world's largest date producer, responsible for nearly 80% of global date exports at its peak in the 1970s. Decades of war, drought, and neglect of the palm groves reduced that figure dramatically, at some points falling below 10% of what it once was. Recovery has been slow and complicated. But the Halawi and the other great Iraqi varieties, the Sayr, the Khadrawi, the Barhi, survived in the groves that remained, maintained by farmers who understood that these palms were not simply agricultural assets, but living records of a civilization that had been eating from them for longer than most nations have existed. There is something in that continuity in the fact that a date palm can live and fruit for over 100 years, and that some of the palms producing Halawi dates today were planted by people whose grandparents had never heard of a world war that makes eating one feel less like a snack and more like a handshake across time. Every date variety in this video grew from the same species, on the same kind of tree, in the same ancient regions where humans first decided that civilization was worth building. The Medjool and the Ajwa and the Barhi and the Zahidi are not just different flavors. They are different answers to the same question that farmers and traders and pilgrims have been asking for 8,000 years. What does this land, this heat, this soil, this water have to offer? The answer keeps being extraordinary. The next time someone puts a date in front of you, ask which one it is. Because the name matters. Because behind the name is a place, and behind the place is a story, and the story is as old as everything we've built. Stay hungry.